Guys, I've got some bad news. Movies are fake and your brain is stupid. Frame rate. What is it? How can you use it? Why are there so goddamn many? First thing you need to understand is there's no such thing as a moving picture. This isn't Hogwarts. But if we take a series of pictures, or frames, and record them and play them back at a certain rate, we can trick our brains into thinking we are seeing movement. You can see this if you go back and look at old film strips. They're individual pictures on a big long reel, which is then fed through a projector at a certain speed, showing us motion. So, what frame rate should you use? It's a complicated question. At absolute minimum, about 12 frames per second allows our brain to see motion. This is usually what animation uses. Well, not really. You see, they'll usually play back at 24 frames per second, but they'll show each frame twice in what is called animating on twos, and that way you get smooth movement with only 12 frames. There are some animations that animate on ones, like Akira, so they have 24 individual frames every second, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back in the early days of cinema, people used to hand crank film cameras. People would also hand crank film projectors. That would mean your frame rate was subject to that person's individual motion, which meant that frame rates varied quite a lot. On average, these rates would go from about 22 to about 26 frames per second. And in the silent days of cinema, this was fine. People would actually use different frame rates throughout their film to give a different effect for each shot. Exciting or action scene, faster frame rate. Slower, more dramatic scene, slower frame rate. When sound got added into cinema though, things had to change. You see, our ears are a lot more sensitive than our eyes are, which means we're far more likely to hear a change in audio than we are to see a change in visuals. So no longer could you change the frame rate at will, it had to remain consistent. So they compromised. If on average we're shooting between 22 and 26, let's meet somewhere in the middle and go for 24. And that's kind of been the standard for cinema ever since.
You see, the Hollywood industrial complex don't like change.
Then we had TV. TV frame rates have nothing to do with cinematic frame rates, and are actually more to do with electricity. Let me explain. In America, the electrical AC current is at 60 Hz, so to avoid a flickering effect on TVs, the images were shown at 30 frames per second, to be exactly half that of the 60 Hz AC current. Except it gets a little bit more complicated when color got involved. So this is where we get into the NTSC format, which for very complicated reasons to add color into the image, they had to take 0.1% off of the frame rate. This is why you might have seen frame rates like 29.97 or 23.98. It's technically 23.976 because 24 minus 0.1%, but we round it because it's easier. And realistically, these are effectively 30 frames per second and 24 frames per second still. Just Americans. It was a necessity when color first came in, and again, people don't like change. Over the pond though, in Europe, we got the PAL format, which was 25 frames per second to match our 50 Hz AC frequency. And those are really your main frame rates. 24 frames per second for cinema, 30 frames per second for American TV, and 25 for European TVs. But what about other frame rates, like 48, or 60, or 120? Well, to demonstrate the main reason why we use these frame rates, let me show you these two clips. Now these are both being played back at 24 frames per second, but this one was shot at 60 frames per second, which means when we play it back, we can slow it down. This is all slow motion is, shooting at a higher frame rate, playing it back at a lower one. We could try and slow down footage that was shot at a lower frame rate, but it gets a little bit choppy. The other reason you might do it is to retain detail in fast-moving subjects. This is why most sports are actually shot at 60 frames per second. The other reason is game streaming. A higher frame rate works for gaming. We want to be able to see what's happening as and when it's happening. And the most attainable frame rate to play things back at is 60. So when we record footage to go alongside it, we record it at 60, so our entire project can be shot, edited, and exported all at the same frame rate. Which is very important. You should always do this to the best of your ability. Shoot, edit, export, same frame rate, all the way through. And that really is the basics of frame rate. 12 frames for animation, on 2s to double it up to 24, which is the same as all other cinema. TV at 30 in the US, 25 in Europe. Go to 60 if you're game streaming or shooting sports, or if you want to use slow motion, go as high as you like. If you have a camera at home with adjustable frame rates, even a lot of phones do it on their cameras nowadays, give it a shot. Try out the different rates, see what results you get. And remember, keep shooting, keep learning. Facial hair looks horrendous. So I'm trying this new thing where I shove a bunch of needles into my face to try and help my beard grow. Because, you know, the only way to beat genetics is with masochism.